They helped bring Jacob Zuma to power in South Africa, but now the workers' unions are flexing their muscles. In a damaging strike season, electricity workers are the latest group to threaten industrial action, which could leave the country in the dark. So, will Zuma pass his first test as president, or will the mood of anger go much further? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Lauren Taylor. More trouble brewing on the horizon for South African President Jacob Zuma. Workers at South Africa's biggest electricity firm, Eskom, threatened to go on strike next week after rejecting a wage offer. They've been offered an 8% increase in wages, which is above the current annual inflation rate of 6.9%, however well below their demand of 14%. Eskom generates 95% of South Africa's electricity and 45% of Africa's. A strike could result in huge disruption to power supplies. South Africa has recently been hit by several strikes, with workers demanding and often receiving large pay rises. Last week, about 150,000 municipal workers ended a week-long strike after being offered a pay rise slightly less than their initial demand, but nearly double the annual inflation rate. Only days before, the government was spared a potentially crippling strike in the mining industry when they managed to agree on a wage deal. With the country facing its first recession in 17 years, President Zuma is likely to find it more difficult to appease the masses. The man is under pressure, but he continues to promise a brighter economic future.
The creation of decent work will be at the center of our economic policies and will influence our investment, attraction and job creation initiatives.
Joining us now are our guests. In Johannesburg, Patrick Craven, he's the spokesperson for the Congress of South African Trade Unions. Also in Johannesburg, Salim Vali, he's a senior researcher at the University of Johannesburg. And in Nairobi, Ali Khan Sachu, an independent investment analyst. Ali Khan Sachu, if I could start with you. If this strike goes ahead at the power company Eskom, how damaging would that be?
Well, they control 95% of the electricity supply in South Africa. You can imagine, you're literally switching the lights off the country. It's an extraordinary thought. And I think they are definitely using that threat to focus some minds. But the challenge to President Zuma has been very early and very sharp. And I think it's really key how it's handled now. But this clearly is an escalation and the ripple effects of it are extremely high.
OK, Patrick Craven, do you think it will actually go ahead, or will it come to a strike?
Well, we certainly hope not. Talks are still due to take place, and I don't want to get involved in the details of what they may be talking about, but obviously there's a good chance that it will be resolved through negotiation, as most disputes are. But could I just raise one issue? This is most categorically not a strike against Jacob Zuma or the government. Eskom now functions basically as a private company, although it is still majority owned by the government. It's in the process of being privatized and acts like any other employer. And this is just a normal industrial dispute where the workers, quite rightly in our view, want higher wages, and the employers are saying no, they can't afford higher wages. So the government is not involved at all.
Salim Vali, would you agree with that assessment, that it's not the government's business?
Well, clearly the government has a 90% stake in Eskom, and Patrick is correct. There have been attempts to privatize the parastatals. This has been resisted by the trade unions, but I think very clearly the state has an interest in intervening. The consequences will be really dramatic, as we've heard.
This obviously is all in the context of previous strikes that have been happening in the last few weeks, and we've heard the council workers' strike actually ended with a wage increase of around 13%. That's almost double the inflation rate. Ali Khan Sachu, can the country afford these above inflation rate settlements like this?
That's a very interesting question, and I think, at the moment we sit in the epicenter of the V in terms of South Africa's economy. Car sales have fallen off a cliff. House prices are down sharply. They're desperately trying to do everything with monetary policy to stir up some activity. And we sit in the very epicenter of this V. And it is entirely debatable as to whether the government has the wherewithal at this point in time to afford these claims. But against that, we've got a political dynamic where the president's, this is the core constituency on whose back the presidency was won for Jacob Zuma. So I think he's between a rock and a hard place. The economy is one side, and the other side are the workers.
Salim Valley, if I could bring you back in, do you think workers are being unrealistic in wanting these kinds of levels of pay rises at a time when there's a recession?
No, absolutely not. I think we really need to contextualize the issue. South Africa has got one of the highest inequalities in the world. If you look at the measurement of inequality, the Gini coefficient, we also have a situation where there's a huge differential between the salaries earned by top management as well as the mass of workers. We're also living in a country where, there's been an ideological, economic, physical war too against the poor of the country. We have 40% unemployment, and it's the employed workers who largely support their brothers and sisters and neighbors who are unemployed. So I really think that it's important to understand that there is a lot of discontent. There is anger on the streets, and the elite should not be surprised. There is conspicuous consumption when the mass of the population live in poverty.
Patrick Craven, is this what this is about? People trying to kind of bridge the gap, if you like, between the very rich and the very poor through large pay rises in these kind of important sectors that are kind of critical to the economy, really?
Absolutely, I totally agree with Salim, and he's taken the words out of my mouth. But I would make the point that when you're on a very, very low wage, 13% does not represent a great deal of money. And we have been arguing for a long time that the lowest paid workers need above inflation increases if they're to improve their standard of living at all. If you simply go for an inflation, you're merely keeping pace with rising prices. You're not actually getting any better off. And if we are serious about bridging this inequality, then we have to go for above inflation increases. But also, we would strongly contest this argument that the way to get out of a recession is to persuade workers to cut their wages. Not only is it grossly unfair for the reasons we've already gone into in terms of equality, but it's also economic nonsense. It means that even less money is being spent, therefore less goods are being bought, less goods are being produced, and even more workers end up losing their jobs. And it's really old-fashioned pre-Keynesian economics, which doesn't make sense.
Ali Khan Satchu, would you agree with that economic interpretation? I mean, is it going to work to have these above-inflation deals?
May I come back on and unpick a couple of threads there? I think clearly what we've seen across sub-Saharan Africa is that basically food inflation and inflation at the bottom of the pyramid is not that number we were just quoting. It's considerably higher. Food prices have spiked considerably, and really the cost of living, the further you drive down in the pyramid, has increased much, much more. So I accept that point. I also think we have had extremely poor trickle down in South Africa. South Africa has, and the other point to make is, unlike other African countries, the apartheid period dispossessed a lot of South Africans from their land in a way that you don't find in other parts of Africa. You will find most Africans have something somewhere outside South Africa. So I accept both those 2 points. But basically, if you have a round of above inflation busting wage increases at this point without any commensurate productivity increases, that is, whichever way you care to look at it, it's not efficient. And I think the point is that sitting down here without much room in a recession, the president has got to be careful. He's got to play two constituencies off. He's got foreign investors who are looking at the economy and have an outsized influence on South Africa. The rand is a freely traded currency. Look what happened over the last 12 months. It's been all over the shop. And just that spoils all kinds of planning. So I do feel that, you know, it's not entirely one way. I do agree with what the points your previous speakers were making, but it is absurd to say that at this point in time, if President Zuma goes and meets everybody's expectations of wage increases, you're not going to get into a vicious spiral. That is, I think, a little bit naive.
Salim Vali, if I could bring you in on that point, so the difference between, well, having to appease on the one hand the foreign investors and on the other the people who voted, or some of the people who voted Jacob Zuma into office. Is there a danger here that the foreign investors start taking flight? And we've seen a bit of a run on the rand recently.
Well, it's interesting that we're talking about the energy utility. Let me talk in very concrete, practical terms. These are not abstract ideas. We have a situation where Alcan, which is a Canadian multinational aluminium corporation, has been given a deal. This was signed in 2006. They will have a huge smelter. The energy they use in that smelter will be the equivalent of half of the consumption rate of the entire city of Cape Town. So the point is, and they are being charged a fraction of the costs that ordinary consumers are being charged. Now, this tells us much about the present situation. It's a function of neoliberalism. You have a situation where the residents of Soweto, which is a township, is asked to pay 28 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas the residents of a northern suburb, a rich area, an affluent area, is charged 16 cents per kilowatt hour. And industry is charged 7 cents. So, you know, the money this utility is getting is disproportionately weighted against the poor. Now, I can give you many such examples. So we do have foreign investment, but really, is this investment really benefiting the people? I mean, Ali talks about trickle down, and this is a very good example. So really, the macroeconomic policy, neoliberalism, has to change. I don't think the people on the ground, their demands are unreasonable. Of course, their expectations have been heightened because of the new president, but these are not unreasonable expectations.
OK, but Patrick Craven, if I could bring you in, do you think that Jacob Zuma will go far enough to satisfying ordinary workers' concerns? I mean, he's still got that constituency, the foreign investors, to keep happy in some ways, hasn't he?
He's made a good start, and we believe that if you want to attract foreign investment, you don't do it by clamping down on the workers, forcing them to accept lower wages. Any intelligent investor will want to invest in a country which has free trade unions, which has democracy, which has human rights. And the idea that unless you have authoritarian government clamping down on what they regard as excessive wage claims, then that isn't the kind of investment that we want. We don't want to see a race to the bottom where investors look around the world to see where they can exploit workers most effectively. That is not something which we or the trade union movement internationally will accept. Okay. Generally, the government's role in any case is not to intervene in wage disputes. It's to provide services to people and to look after the overall growth of the economy, and on that he's definitely made a good start. Particularly, he's been much more willing to involve the trade unions, civil society and business in formulating policy rather than trying to impose ideas from above.
OK. Let's just recap on the situation that we've been in. Jacob Zuma came to office less than 3 months ago. Job seekers, domestic workers, farm workers and the unions, as we were saying, were instrumental in that decisive victory. They were his biggest supporters then and could theoretically pose the biggest threat to him now. They expect him and his African National Congress Party to deliver on the promises made during the election campaign. These include introducing a national health insurance system, bringing down the levels of unemployment and fighting poverty, in addition providing what they called adequate housing for the military veterans who fought white minority rule. The ANC also promised universal access to food, water and sanitation. If I can go back to Ali Khan Sachu, I mean, there have been obviously strikes and some violence in the recent weeks. Do you think that's just part of the mood of dissatisfaction?
Well, it's interesting to try and understand it better. I think the threshold given, and I think it's a particularly South African thing, it seems to be much higher. And I think investors until now, until the last couple of days, seem to be pretty sanguine about it. But you know, when I watched the news and I saw African policemen firing rubber bullets at protesters, I thought to myself, this is not an image that President Zuma can have resonating for very long. It's just plain, it doesn't make any political sense for him. So I do feel that in a sense we have the unions pressing their advantage very, very hard at this moment when the economy is actually on the back foot. And my question is to the other two speakers, do you feel that the President, one, owes you these inflation-busting rises right now? And do you feel that your man is in there to deliver this as part of his presidency? And I think that's the sense. And without showing some kind of firmness, an ability to say enough, I think the President looks a little bit weaker.
Salim Valley, can I bring you in on that point? I mean, is there a danger that Jacob Zuma could be politically weakened by its being seen to be giving in to demands of the unions at all stages?
Well, you know, there are a number of assumptions here. I mean, one is talking as if the workers live luxurious lives. We are talking of the working poor as well. I think we've talked about how it's perhaps disingenuous to talk about these wage increases as, you know, much higher than the inflation rate, and therefore perhaps give the impression that this is unreasonable. There are many other factors that we can't go into right now, but also by the same token to talk about perhaps problems of productivity in an unscientific way is also sending out the wrong message. Workers work very hard in our country, and Patrick talked about this very hard-won gains, the right to strike, union benefits and protection. These are hard-won rights. Now the problem is that we do live in a capitalist society. There are social contradictions. Jacob Zuma can't be everything to all people, and you know, it's not a consensual society, even though the government might come across as being an impartial referee. They have to take sides, and of course, if he takes the sides of big business, he will lose support.
Okay.
And once again, what happened with Thabo Mbeki.
Yeah, let me just bring Patrick Craven in on the issue of so the broader issue of that we talked about just now, about what the ANC promised when it in its election manifestos. I mean, does the government also need to be seen to be delivering on some of those promises of, you know, better housing and, you know, improved access to sanitation? How quickly does that need to happen to sort of diffuse the kind of what seemed like underlying anger in the rioting that we saw a few weeks ago?
It obviously has to happen as quickly as possible. Remember, this government's only been there for just over 4 months, and no one would expect them to have solved all these huge problems in that time. But we believe that this government has shown a willingness to confront the problems and to look for solutions in a much more effective way than previous ones. But it was never part of the government's promise that it would intervene on wages. And I can't understand the way the media keep talking as though the wage issues are a confrontation with the government, or that the government has either been weak or strong. Nearly all the wage disputes recently have been with private employers, and they have been bargained between the two sides, and in most cases have been resolved without strike action.
In the case
I
of
simply
Eskom,
don't
though,
understand where the point about the
Eskom
strike action somehow is translated into an attack upon the government.
But that's because
as Salim says,
because
it's
a government
basically a
that's heavily
struggle
backed by
to
the
raise
unions.
living
I mean, that happens
standards
in any country
and to
where
get out of the poverty
Craven, just
that they have been in for so many years.
Sorry, let me interrupt you. You know, a government that's heavily backed by the unions is likely to face that correlation between what the unions want and what the people want. So I don't think it's an absurd correlation to make. Just on the point of what the government can deliver, how quickly can it happen? I mean, he's already seen rioting on the streets. How much time does he have before people really start getting even more angry?
You obviously can't put a specific time because some developments will take longer than others. But there is already progress being made in many areas. New houses are being built, new schools are being built. Not enough, not fast enough. We would totally agree with that. And therefore we have to find solutions. And we think that we are more likely to find solutions with this government than with the previous ones, and the trade unions will help.
Okay.
But that has absolutely nothing to do with workers trying to improve their living standards.
Okay, Ali Khan, let me just bring back in Ali Khan
trade union activity.
Let me just bring Ali Khan Sachu. Do you think that there is a time limit on here? And also, I suppose, give it some context. South Africa is clearly the biggest economy in the region. How much does the rest of the region need a politically stable and economically stable South Africa?
It's absolutely central. I mean, it's the entry point, the window into Africa for so many foreign investors, for so many Africans. It really is the linchpin. And I do accept the point about President Zuma. I think, he has much more of a sense of outreach. He's able to go into the Afrikaner hinterland and speak to them. He's able to go and speak to the workers, his core constituency. He's in a way a very strong political persona. And I think that's part of his skill and part of his political capital. But I ask my other two speakers, how long can this process has to surely be nipped in the bud. I mean, you cannot have this playing out. We live in an accelerated world, open markets. If this thing spills out onto the streets, we see it going on week after week. If the lights, you can say it's a private company, but electricity is in the national interest. I mean, however private they are, they affect the whole country. So I think to say it's entirely a private sector issue is a little bit disingenuous anyway. I mean, if there's no electricity in a country, you haven't got any lights, your industry's not working, the ripple effects for the economy are enormous. I mean, you can lock percentage points off GDP if your lights are off for a couple of weeks.
Salim Valley, just to answer that point, if you can briefly for me, how critical is it to resolve this particular dispute quickly?
Well, I think it's very critical. By the way, I didn't say it's a private company. It is a parastatal. But I think that, we need to look at the utility itself. I've given you one concrete example. I can give you many others as well. I mean, we don't want a situation where the problem persists over a long period if we don't look at the fundamental issues. And at the moment, the economy is structured in the way that perpetuates inequality.
Okay, I'm afraid I have to stop you there. I'm afraid I'll have to stop you there. We've run out of time.
It's not the workers.
Thank you very much to all our guests, Patrick Craven, Ali Khan Sachu and Salim Valley. Thank you for joining us. And also, thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We always welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.